The hull screamed before I did. That is the part nobody believes when I tell it. Metal has a voice when it dies, and on that day, above a brown and blue world called Earth, I heard my ship speak for the last time. My name is Threll, and I commanded a battle group of the Vrex Compact, a power that had ruled 1,000 star systems without ever losing a single campaign. I am old now, my hands shake when I hold a cup of tea, but my mind has never once let go of that day, and it never will. I was young then, though I did not feel young. I felt certain. Certainty was the currency of my people. We did not fight wars, not really. We solved them. Every battle was mapped before the first shot. Every enemy studied until their reactions became numbers on a screen. When my superiors told me that the species called humans would surrender within 3 days of first contact, I believed them, because every species before them had. The order came from the High Council itself. A small, backward world, still burning fuel to escape its own gravity, still fighting itself over borders drawn in dirt. We sent one ship, one. That is how little threat we believed them to be. My commanding officer at the time, a Vrex named Doran, laughed when he read the specifications of their strongest warship. He said, and I remember this exactly, that we were sending a hunting knife to fight a species armed with sticks. We broadcast the ultimatum in every language their own satellites had ever transmitted into space. Surrender your world, accept compact rule, live in peace under our protection. It was the same message we had sent to 100 other worlds, and 100 other worlds had answered with trembling voices and open hands. Earth answered differently. The reply came back in under an hour, translated by our own systems into words too strange to be a mistake. It was short. It did not beg. It did not negotiate. It simply said that they had read our history, understood our intentions, and would see us on the field. I remember the silence on the bridge when those words appeared. Nobody laughed anymore. I want to tell you what confidence looks like right before it breaks, because I do not think anyone truly understands it until they have lived through it. Confidence does not shatter all at once. It cracks slowly, quietly, like ice under a boot, and you keep walking because you refuse to believe the sound you just heard. We entered their solar system with 7 vessels, a modest show of force meant to remind them of what waited behind it if they refused again. 7 ships against a species that had not yet built a single vessel capable of crossing between stars. It should have been over before it began. Their first response was not a fleet. It was a single ship, small compared to ours, moving with a kind of reckless purpose I had never seen in an enemy before. My sensors told me it was outgunned 11-1. My training told me it would turn back. I remember watching the screen, waiting for the retreat vector to appear. It never did. That ship came straight at my formation, weapons blazing before it was even in effective range, as if the pilot wanted us to know they had seen us and were not afraid. We destroyed it, of course. Our shields barely registered the impact of their weapons, but something about the way it died stayed with me. It did not flee. It did not surrender. It simply kept firing until there was nothing left to fire with. Doran called it a fluke. A single reckless captain, he said, does not represent an entire species. He was an experienced commander, decorated many times over, and I trusted his judgment more than I trusted my own unease. So we pressed forward, deeper into their system, expecting the surrender we had been promised. What we found instead was a planet already awake. Their communications channels were alive with a strange, sharp kind of chatter, voices that did not sound frightened so much as focused. I had studied dozens of species before my first battle. I knew what fear sounded like across different tongues, different frequencies, different kinds of throats. This was not fear. I did not have a word for it yet. We made planetfall negotiations, or tried to. A shuttle was sent down to a coastal city to establish contact with their leadership. Standard procedure, the same procedure that had worked flawlessly on 82 other worlds. I was not on that shuttle, and looking back, that is the only reason I am alive to tell you this story. The shuttle did not return. There was no explosion, no distress call, nothing dramatic in the way our sensors recorded it. It simply stopped transmitting. 3 hours later, a message arrived on an open frequency, spoken calmly by a woman with a steady voice, informing us that our representatives were, in her words, no longer available for further discussion, and that we should consider our next move very carefully before making it. I remember Doran's face when he heard that message. It was the first time I saw something other than certainty in his eyes. We convened an emergency council aboard my flagship. Half of my officers argued for immediate escalation, a show of overwhelming force to remind this small, stubborn world exactly what it was dealing with. The other half argued for patience, for more study, more data before we risked further losses. I said very little in that meeting. I was still trying to understand what I had heard in that woman's voice. It was not defiance for the sake of pride. It was something colder, something calculated in a way I did not expect from a species so far behind us in nearly every measurable way. In the end, escalation won. It always did, in those days. We had built an empire on the principle that overwhelming force ends resistance quickly and with the fewest possible losses on both sides. It was, in its own strange way, meant to be merciful. Fewer battles meant fewer deaths. That was the philosophy that had guided the compact for 10,000 years, and I had never once questioned it. So we moved our full battle group into low orbit, weapons ready, and broadcast a final warning. Stand down, or face the consequences your own history has taught you to fear. I believed, truly believed, that this would be the moment they broke. Every species broke eventually. It was simply a matter of finding the right amount of pressure. Their answer came not as words this time, but as light. Dozens of small craft rose from the surface at once, from bases we had not detected, using technology our scans had somehow failed to register. They were faster than our models predicted, more numerous than our reconnaissance had shown, and flying in patterns that made no logical sense according to every combat doctrine I had ever studied. I want to be clear about something. We were still, by every technical measure, the superior force that day. Our shields were stronger, our weapons carried greater range, our ships had survived encounters that would have vaporized anything from their world in an instant. And yet, as those small craft closed the distance with a speed and determination that defied every calculation my tactical officers had run, I felt something I had never felt in any previous engagement. I felt afraid, not of losing the battle. I still believed we would win the battle. I was afraid of what kind of species fought like this, against odds that offered them nothing but destruction, without the slightest hesitation in their approach. I had fought soldiers who fought for glory, for survival, for their families waiting below. I had never fought anyone who fought simply because giving up was not a concept they seemed to understand. The first true exchange of weapons fire lasted only minutes, but it changed everything I believed about war. Their ships took losses, heavy losses, the kind of losses that should have broken any fleet's will to continue. And still they came. Still they pressed forward, adapting their formations mid-battle in ways my tactical computer flagged as statistically irrational. And yet those irrational choices kept working just well enough to cost us more than we expected to lose. By the end of that first engagement, we held the field. Technically, we had won. Our losses were minimal. Theirs were significant, and by every metric the compact used to measure victory, the day belonged to us. But I remember standing on my bridge afterward, looking down at that blue and brown world, and feeling none of the satisfaction that victory was supposed to bring. Doran stood beside me, silent for a long moment before he finally spoke. He said that we had won the battle, but he was no longer certain what kind of war we had just started. I did not sleep that night, if you could call the artificial cycle aboard a starship night. I kept replaying that woman's voice in my mind, the calm, steady warning she had given us before the fighting even began. I kept thinking about those small ships, hopelessly outmatched, refusing to turn back even as they burned around each other. We had come to this world expecting a quick and simple conquest, the same story we had lived 100 times before across 100 other worlds. I did not know it yet, standing there on that bridge with my hands folded behind my back and my confidence quietly bleeding out of me, but that day was only the very beginning of the nightmare. The true horror, the kind that would haunt every soldier under my command for years to come, had not even started. It was still waiting for us, somewhere down on that stubborn little world, and it would not stay waiting for long. 3 weeks after that first battle, I stopped trusting the word impossible. My tactical officers used it constantly in those early days, muttering it under their breath every time the humans did something our models said they should not have been able to do. I banned the word from my bridge eventually. It had stopped being useful. It had become an excuse. We had settled into what the High Council called a containment posture, a strategy meant to slowly squeeze the human military into submission through pressure rather than a single overwhelming strike. The logic was sound on paper. Deny them resources, cut their supply lines, force their leadership to choose between surrender and slow collapse. It had worked on every other world that had ever resisted us. I had helped enforce it myself, twice before, against far more advanced enemies than this one appeared to be. The trouble was, humans did not seem to understand that they were supposed to be collapsing. I remember the battle that broke something inside me, though it took years before I could admit that to myself, let alone say it aloud to anyone else. It happened near a debris field left over from an earlier skirmish, a graveyard of broken hulls drifting silently between us and a human outpost we intended to isolate. My fleet moved in formation exactly as doctrine demanded, spread wide enough to avoid a single decisive strike, close enough to support one another if resistance appeared. Resistance appeared faster than our sensors could track it. A woman named Grace Whitmore commanded the human forces that day. I did not know her name at the time. I learned it much later, from records recovered after the war, and by then her name had already become something of a legend among both sides, though for very different reasons. Her fleet was a fraction of ours in size. Her ships were built from scavenged parts and stubborn engineering, patched together in ways that should not have held under combat stress, and yet they held. She did not open with a broad assault, the way our doctrine expected an outmatched commander to behave when cornered. She opened by sending 3 of her smallest, fastest vessels directly into the debris field ahead of us, weaving between broken hulls with a precision that made my helmsman go quiet. I asked him what she was doing. He did not know. Neither did I. Neither did the tactical computer, which kept recalculating probabilities that made less and less sense the longer we watched. It took us far too long to understand her plan, because her plan was not a plan any of us would have considered reasonable. She was using the wreckage of dead ships, our ships and theirs both, as cover and as obstacles. Her small vessels dragged debris into our flight paths using tow cables never designed for combat, forcing 2 of my cruisers to break formation to avoid collision. It should not have worked. Debris does not win wars, and yet it cost me 2 ships before I even understood I was under attack in any conventional sense. I gave the order to concentrate fire on her flagship, a modest vessel she called the Meridian, hoping to end the engagement quickly by removing its command structure. My tactical officer informed me this would take perhaps 4 minutes given her ship's shielding, which our scans suggested was minimal at best. I remember feeling something close to relief. 4 minutes, and this strange, chaotic battle would be over. It took 11. Her ship absorbed damage that should have ended it twice over, continuing to fight, continuing to maneuver, continuing to somehow keep its weapons online even as our sensors reported failure after failure across nearly every system aboard it. I did not understand it then. I understand it now, though understanding it does not make it any less unsettling. Humans built redundancy into everything, not because their engineering was more advanced than ours, but because they seemed to expect, on some deep and instinctive level, that everything would eventually break, and they refused to let that stop them. When her ship finally lost propulsion, drifting helpless in the debris field, I expected her to signal surrender. Every commander I had ever faced, human or otherwise, signaled surrender once retreat and victory were both taken off the table. I opened a channel, prepared to offer terms, prepared to end this particular chapter of the engagement with the same courtesy the compact always extended to a defeated foe. Grace Whitmore's voice came through calm and steady, without a trace of fear in it, and she said something I have never forgotten. She said that a ship without engines was still a ship with weapons, and she intended to use every single one of them for as long as her crew kept breathing. She was not exaggerating. Her remaining defenses stayed active far longer than any reasonable commanders should have, forcing us to spend far more effort finishing that engagement than any rational calculation would have predicted. I lost soldiers securing what should have been an unarmed, defeated target, soldiers whose loss any senior officer back home would have called an unacceptable waste for a target of so little remaining strategic value. That was the day I stopped believing this war would be quick. The engagement that followed only deepened my unease. Word had apparently spread quickly among human forces about what had happened in that debris field, and rather than deterring them, it seemed to embolden every unit we encountered afterward. A young pilot named Nathan Pierce, flying a heavily modified interceptor, engaged 3 of my fighters alone rather than retreat when his squadron was scattered. He should have lost that fight in the first exchange. Instead, he brought down one of my fighters through a maneuver so reckless my own pilots initially assumed it was a mistake rather than a deliberate choice. He did not survive that engagement either, in the end, but the way my remaining pilots spoke about it afterward, in hushed voices over secure channels, told me this was not an isolated case of one soldier's desperation. It was becoming a pattern, and patterns, in war, are far more dangerous than single acts of bravery. I began requesting psychological assessments on captured human personnel, hoping to find some explanation, some flaw in their thinking that would let me predict their next move instead of constantly reacting to it. What I found instead unsettled me more than any battle report had. Our interrogators, experienced across dozens of conquered species, reported that human prisoners did not respond to standard pressure techniques the way every other species had. Threats produced defiance rather than compliance. Offers of comfort in exchange for information were often refused outright, sometimes with what our interrogators described, almost bewildered, as something close to genuine amusement. One prisoner, a young officer named Daniel Hargrove, was asked why his people continued fighting a war they could not possibly win by any measurable standard. I read the transcript of that interrogation more times than I can count over the years that followed. He said that measurable standards were not the only thing that mattered, and that his people had never once, in their entire recorded history, been very good at knowing when to stop fighting for something they believed was theirs. I remember showing that transcript to Doran late one night, both of us exhausted from weeks of engagements that never seemed to end the way our doctrine promised they would. He read it twice, then set it down and asked me a question I could not answer. He asked what happens to an army built entirely around the assumption that every enemy eventually breaks, when it finally meets one that simply does not. Neither of us had an answer that night. We would both spend the rest of the war trying to find one. Our command structure back home grew increasingly impatient as reports filtered in of mounting losses far exceeding anything projected for a campaign against a technologically inferior species. The High Council began sending advisors, then investigators, then eventually a new Supreme Commander to review our conduct of the war personally, convinced that our difficulties were the result of poor leadership rather than an enemy that simply refused to behave the way 10,000 years of compact doctrine insisted an outmatched enemy should behave. I welcomed the scrutiny at first. I wanted someone, anyone, to look at what we were facing and tell me I was wrong, that there was a simple explanation, a weakness we had not yet found, a single pressure point that would finally bring this stubborn little world to its knees, the way every world before it eventually had. What I got instead was a campaign 3 months later that would make everything I had witnessed so far feel like a gentle introduction to what this war actually was. We received intelligence suggesting a major human production site was hidden within a mountain range on the eastern edge of their largest continent, a site responsible for the rapidly evolving technology that had cost us so dearly in every engagement so far. Destroying it, our new Supreme Commander insisted, would cripple their ability to continue resisting and finally force the surrender that should have come within days of our arrival. I was given command of the ground effort meant to secure and destroy that site. It remains, to this day, among the most difficult experiences of my very long life, and it taught me something about human beings that no report, no interrogation transcript, and no simulation could ever have prepared me for. We arrived under cover of darkness, a full battalion equipped with the finest gear the Compact had ever fielded, expecting minimal resistance given the remote and heavily forested terrain surrounding our target. Our scans showed a modest human presence, lightly equipped by every standard we understood. On paper, it should have taken less than a day to secure the site and begin its destruction. The forest itself seemed to work against us from the very first hour. Dense canopy interfered with our aerial support in ways our engineers had not fully accounted for. The terrain, steep and uneven, slowed our advance far more than projected, and the humans, few as they were according to our initial estimates, used every inch of that difficult ground with a familiarity that suggested they had spent years preparing for exactly this kind of engagement. A woman named Ruth Sinclair, a field medic attached to the defending unit, became something of a quiet legend among my own soldiers after that campaign, though not for reasons any of them were proud to admit. She was held briefly during the fighting, kept under guard while my officers attempted to gather information about the site's defenses. She gave them nothing useful, not through silence, but through a calm, almost gentle stream of misdirection so convincing that it took my intelligence officers nearly 6 hours to realize every piece of information she had given them was carefully, deliberately false. By the time we corrected our approach based on her false information, we had already paid a heavy price for a defensive position that should not have existed according to what she had told us. When my officers later asked her, with something close to frustration, why she had lied so calmly to an occupying force, she reportedly only said that she did not see any reason to feel sorry about it. The fighting inside that mountain range lasted 9 days, far longer than any single engagement fought anywhere else in the war up to that point. Every position we took cost more than our commanders had budgeted for. Every retreat the humans staged turned out to be a trap rather than genuine withdrawal. And every soldier we captured, without exception, gave us nothing of real value, no matter what methods our interrogators employed. By the 9th day, the site itself turned out to be almost entirely empty, a decoy built specifically to draw us into terrain where our technological advantages meant far less than they should have. The real production facility, we later learned, had been relocated months earlier, the moment human intelligence realized we were closing in on its location. They had let us waste enormous effort on an empty building, simply to buy themselves more time and to teach us a lesson about how costly every future engagement against them was going to be. I stood among the ruins of that empty site on the 9th day, surrounded by soldiers who had fought hard for something of no real strategic value, and I finally understood something that would define the rest of this war for me. We were not fighting a species that lacked the strength to win outright. We were fighting a species that had decided, somewhere in the earliest hours of this conflict, that if they could not win quickly, they would make absolutely certain that we could never win cheaply either. Doran found me there among the wreckage, and for the first time since I had known him, this seasoned, decorated commander looked genuinely shaken. He asked me what kind of war we had actually walked into, and I told him honestly that I no longer believed it was a war we fully understood at all. We had come to this small, stubborn world expecting a simple conquest measured in days. By the time we stood in those quiet mountains counting the cost, we had already begun to suspect, though none of us wanted to say it aloud yet, that we might be measuring this war in years instead, and that the true price of finishing it might be far higher than anything the Compact had ever paid before. After the mountains, the High Council stopped calling it a campaign and started calling it a war, and something about that small change in language shifted the mood across the entire fleet. Soldiers who had once spoken of returning home within a season now spoke carefully, quietly, about not knowing when this would end at all. I felt that shift most clearly in myself. I had stopped counting the days since we arrived. I had started counting the friends I had lost instead. The ground war spread across 3 continents within a single year, and it stopped looking anything like the wars I had studied throughout my long career. There were no clean lines anymore, no clear front where our forces faced theirs in open, honest combat. Every quiet valley might hide a defensive position. Every abandoned town might be rigged to collapse the moment we secured it. Every civilian face we encountered might belong to someone quietly relaying our position to forces waiting just beyond the horizon. I remember a supply convoy we lost near a river crossing, guarded by 2 full companies of my most experienced soldiers. The attack came from beneath the water itself, divers who had waited motionless for hours in cold, dark currents, striking only when our convoy was fully committed to the crossing and could neither retreat nor properly defend itself. We lost the convoy entirely. We never even saw the faces of the soldiers who took it from us. By the time our reinforcements arrived, the attackers were gone, vanished back into a countryside that seemed to swallow them whole every single time. A man named Peter Doyle led that particular unit, according to records recovered much later in the war. He became something of a ghost story among my own troops, a name spoken with equal parts frustration and grudging respect. His unit struck supply lines, communication relays, and isolated outposts with a consistency that made every soldier under my command nervous simply walking through open terrain. He was never caught. He was never even properly seen by any surviving witness on our side. He simply appeared in our reports as a pattern of losses that never quite added up to a face we could put a name to until the fighting was already over. What disturbed me most was not his skill, though it was considerable. It was the letters. Twice during that year, my forces recovered handwritten notes left behind at the scenes of his attacks, addressed directly to whichever commander would eventually read them. They were not threats. They were not demands. They were, strange as it sounds, almost courteous, explaining in plain and simple language exactly why the attack had been necessary, exactly what resources had been destroyed, and occasionally offering a kind of grim respect for the soldiers we had lost in the exchange. One note, which I still remember nearly word for word after all these years, ended with a simple line that stayed with me far longer than any of his tactics did. It said that he took no pleasure in what he did, but that he intended to keep doing it for as long as we remained on his world. I began to understand, slowly and uncomfortably, that this was not simple resistance born of desperation. It was a philosophy, deeply held, that these people carried with them into every single engagement, no matter how small or how costly. They were not fighting because they believed they would win, in the conventional sense the compact understood victory. They were fighting because giving up was, to them, a kind of defeat far worse than death itself. The psychological toll on my own soldiers grew heavier with every passing month. I began noticing changes in officers I had served alongside for decades, veterans who had faced far more powerful enemies without a single moment of hesitation. They grew quiet during briefings. They flinched at sudden noises during otherwise calm patrols. Some requested transfers to other fronts, citing exhaustion, though we all understood the real reason without ever needing to say it aloud. One of my most capable pilots, a Vrex named Kale, came to me privately one evening and asked to be relieved of duty. I asked him why, expecting the usual explanations of fatigue or minor injury. Instead, he told me something that troubled me for a very long time afterward. He said that he had begun to dream about the humans we fought, not as enemies to be defeated, but as something closer to a force of nature, patient and endless, that would simply keep coming no matter how many of them we destroyed. He said he no longer believed we could win this war in any way that would feel like winning. I did not relieve him of duty that night. I should have. 3 weeks later, his ship was among those lost in an engagement near a coastal city, and I have carried the weight of that conversation with me every day since. The humans, for their part, seemed to understand exactly what effect their tactics were having on us, and they leaned into it without hesitation. Captured compact soldiers were sometimes released rather than held, returned to our lines shaken, disoriented, and full of stories that spread through the fleet faster than any official report ever could. I met one such soldier myself, a young Vrex named Saren, who had been captured during a failed reconnaissance mission and released nearly 2 weeks later without explanation. Saren told me the humans holding him had not harmed him in any way that could be measured or reported through official channels. They had fed him, given him medical care for a minor injury sustained during his capture, and spoken to him at length, calmly and without hostility, about their history, their reasons for fighting, and their absolute certainty that they would rather see their entire species destroyed than live under compact rule. He said the woman who spoke with him most often, a calm and thoughtful officer named Clara Bennett, had told him something he could not stop repeating afterward. She had said that fear was not the same thing as surrender, and that his commanders would do well to learn the difference before it cost them everything. Saren was never quite the same after his release. He completed his remaining service without incident, but he requested reassignment to a non-combat role the moment his obligation allowed it, and I did not blame him for a moment. The siege that changed me most personally came nearly 2 years into the ground war, at a fortified position built into the side of a river valley that our forces had been ordered to take at any cost. Intelligence suggested it held a small garrison, poorly supplied, on the verge of collapse after months of what our command believed was a successful blockade. I led the assault myself, confident, for the first time in longer than I could remember, that we had finally found the breaking point we had spent years searching for. The garrison was not poorly supplied. It was not on the verge of collapse. Every report we had received had been carefully, deliberately fed to us through channels we believed were secure, crafted specifically to draw our forces into a valley that offered no room to maneuver and no clean line of retreat once the fighting began. I remember the moment the trap closed around us with a clarity I have never lost, even after all these years. The valley walls, which our scans had identified as stable rock formations, were in fact riddled with charges placed months in advance, triggered the moment our forces were fully committed to the approach. The resulting collapse did not destroy us outright, but it split my forces into isolated pockets, cut off from resupply, cut off from retreat, and surrounded on every side by defenders who had clearly been waiting for exactly this moment for a very long time. I found myself pinned down for nearly 18 hours alongside a small group of my remaining soldiers, unable to advance, unable to retreat, listening to the sounds of a battle we were slowly, unmistakably losing. It was during those long hours, crouched in the ruins of what had once been a supply depot, that I first began to understand something about these people that no report had ever properly captured. A young human soldier, no older than what would have been considered barely an adult by Vrex standards, found our position sometime near the end of those 18 hours. His name, I learned much later, was Owen Baxter, and he had every advantage in that moment. My group was exhausted, low on ammunition, and in no condition to mount any real resistance. He could have ended the engagement then and there with very little risk to himself. He did not. Instead, he called out to us in careful, halting words clearly learned specifically for moments like this one, offering safe passage if we surrendered our weapons and agreed to be held rather than continue fighting a battle we had already lost. I remember the confusion I felt in that moment, more than the fear. Every doctrine I had ever studied insisted that a cornered enemy should be finished quickly and completely, with no risk left to chance. And yet here was a young soldier, offering mercy to an enemy who had come across the stars specifically to conquer his world. I ordered my remaining soldiers to surrender. I am not ashamed to admit that now, though for many years afterward I carried a strange kind of guilt about the decision, as though survival itself had somehow been a failure of duty. Owen Baxter kept his word. We were held under guard, treated with a strange and unfamiliar decency, and eventually exchanged for human prisoners some months later, as part of a limited agreement negotiated between exhausted commanders on both sides. Before that exchange took place, I spoke with him once, late one evening, through a translator device that struggled badly with the nuances of both our languages. I asked him, as plainly as the device would allow, why he had offered us mercy when every advantage that day belonged entirely to him. His answer has stayed with me for the rest of my life, clearer in my memory than almost anything else from that terrible war. He said that killing an enemy who had already lost did not feel like victory to him. It felt like something closer to shame. He said his people had learned, over many generations of fighting among themselves long before we ever arrived, that how you treated a defeated enemy said far more about your own character than how you treated a defeated enemy who still had teeth. I did not understand him fully that night. I understand him a great deal better now, after decades spent reflecting on everything that happened between our two peoples. It was during that long, quiet exchange that I first began to suspect the true nature of what we were fighting. It was not simply a matter of superior tactics, or unfamiliar terrain, or unpredictable strategy, though all of those things certainly played their part in every defeat we suffered. It was something closer to conviction, a kind of belief so deeply held that it shaped every single decision these people made, in victory and in defeat alike. They fought as though losing was always possible, And yet they fought as though giving up was never an option worth considering, and somewhere in the space between those two truths, they had built a resistance that our entire empire, built across 10,000 years and 1,000 conquered worlds, simply had no answer for. When I finally returned to my own forces after the prisoner exchange, thinner and quieter than the officer who had led that ill-fated assault into the valley, Doran barely recognized me at first. He asked what had happened to me during my time in captivity, expecting stories of hardship, of mistreatment, of the kind of suffering our own doctrine assumed any defeated enemy would inflict on captured soldiers. I told him the truth instead, and I watched his face change as I spoke, the same slow, uncomfortable realization I had already reached myself settling over him in real time. We had spent years treating this war as a problem of tactics and technology, searching endlessly for the single weakness that would finally bring these people to their knees, the way every other world before them eventually had. We had never once considered that the true source of their strength was not something we could target with weapons at all. The High Council summoned me back to the capital world nearly 3 years after the war began, an unusual honor that felt, in the moment, far more like an accusation. I stood before a chamber of officials who had never once set foot near the front lines, men and women who still spoke of humans in the same dismissive terms we had used on the very first day of this conflict, and I understood immediately that explaining what I had seen would be far harder than surviving it. I told them everything. The debris field, the mountain siege, the valley ambush, the strange and unsettling mercy of a young soldier named Owen Baxter. I told them about the letters left behind by a man we never caught, and the calm, unshaken voice of a woman who had warned us, on the very first day, that we should think carefully before making our next move. I told them as clearly as I could that this was not a war we were losing due to poor tactics or weak leadership. It was a war we had never truly understood how to fight from the very beginning. The reaction in that chamber was not what I expected. I had prepared myself for disbelief, for accusations of exaggeration, perhaps even for consequences to my own career, for delivering news no one wanted to hear. Instead, I watched something far more unsettling settle over that room: silence. The particular kind of silence that comes not from disagreement, but from quiet confirmation of fears that had already been growing, unspoken, for far too long. It turned out I was not the only commander summoned that season. 6 others stood beside me, each having led forces on different fronts, against different human factions spread across their fractured but fiercely coordinated defense. Each of us told a version of the same story, different details, different battles, the same conclusion. This was not a species that could be pressured into submission through patient escalation. This was a species that treated escalation itself as an invitation to escalate further, no matter the cost. One commander, an older Vrex named Sella who had led forces on the southern continent, said something that night that I have never forgotten. She said that in 10,000 years of compact history, we had faced clever enemies, resourceful enemies, even enemies willing to die rather than surrender their homes. But we had never faced an enemy that seemed to find something like purpose in the fighting itself, independent of whether victory was even possible. The High Council took nearly 6 months to formally acknowledge what those of us on the front lines had already understood for years. During that time, the war did not pause to wait for their conclusions. It simply grew worse. Human forces, once scattered and reactive, had begun coordinating across previously fractured factions in ways our intelligence had never anticipated. Nations that our reports insisted had been fighting one another for generations before our arrival now shared resources, technology, and strategy with a speed and trust that should have taken decades to build under normal circumstances. It seemed our invasion had accomplished something no human conflict ever had. It had united them. I remember the first time I encountered this unified human command directly, during an engagement near their western coastline that would come to be remembered, on both sides, as one of the defining battles of the entire war. A general named Henry Caldwell coordinated the defense that day, drawing together forces from what had once been rival nations into a single, cohesive fighting force that moved with a discipline our own doctrine had never expected from a species so recently at odds with itself. My fleet outnumbered his defenders nearly 3-1 when the engagement began. By every measure our tactical computers could calculate, victory should have been swift and decisive. I had learned by that point in the war to distrust those calculations more than I trusted my own instincts. And my instincts that day told me something was deeply wrong long before the fighting itself confirmed it. Caldwell's forces did not meet us in open engagement the way our doctrine assumed a unified defense would. Instead, they drew our fleet into a slow, grinding pursuit across a stretch of ocean riddled with hidden defenses, automated systems, and coordinated strikes launched from positions we had no way of detecting until it was far too late to respond effectively. Every hour of that pursuit cost us more than the last, small losses accumulating into something far larger than any single engagement should have produced. By the time we finally broke off the pursuit, having achieved nothing resembling the decisive victory we had entered the engagement expecting, I understood that we had just witnessed something far more significant than a single tactical defeat. We had witnessed an entire species finish learning how to fight us on its own terms, using every hard lesson from 3 years of brutal conflict to build a defense that no longer resembled the desperate, scattered resistance we had first encountered. The mood aboard my flagship after that battle was unlike anything I had experienced in my long career. I had commanded soldiers through difficult losses before, but this was different. This was the quiet, creeping realization, shared silently across an entire fleet, that we were no longer simply losing battles here and there. We were losing the war itself, slowly, inevitably, no matter how many resources the Compact continued to pour into this stubborn, unyielding little world. Defections began not long after, quiet at first, then increasingly difficult to ignore. Soldiers who had served the Compact faithfully for decades requested transfers away from the human front in numbers that alarmed even the High Council. Some simply refused orders outright, citing exhaustion, moral uncertainty, or in a few cases, an open admission that they no longer believed this war could be won in any way that justified its continuing cost. I understood their reasoning more than I was willing to admit at the time. I had begun to feel it myself, a heaviness that settled deeper into me with every fresh report of losses, every new story of human resilience that defied everything I had once believed about how war was supposed to work. I had entered this conflict as a confident, decorated commander, certain of victory within days. I had become, over the course of 3 brutal years, something closer to a man simply trying to survive long enough to understand what had actually happened to him. Doran, who had stood beside me since the very beginning of this war, finally broke during a quiet moment aboard my flagship, not long after that coastal engagement. I found him alone in the observation deck, staring out at the same blue and brown world we had once believed would surrender within days of our arrival. He asked me, quietly, whether I believed we had made a mistake coming here at all. I did not have an easy answer for him that night, and I still do not, even now, after decades spent reflecting on everything that followed. What I told him instead was something closer to the truth as I understood it in that moment. I told him that I no longer believed this war had ever been about conquest in the way the Compact understood conquest. I believed we had stumbled, entirely by accident, into a conflict with a species that measured strength differently than we did, and that no amount of firepower would ever be enough to defeat a people who simply refused to accept defeat as a possibility. The High Council finally convened an emergency session nearly 4 years into the war, faced with mounting losses, plummeting morale, and increasingly vocal dissent from commanders across every front. I was asked to speak before that session personally, one of the few surviving commanders who had led forces from the very earliest days of the conflict through to its current, grinding stalemate. I told them plainly that continuing this war, as we had been fighting it, would only cost the Compact more than any conceivable victory could ever be worth. I told them about Grace Whitmore and Owen Baxter and the calm, unshaken voices of soldiers who had never once, in 4 years of brutal fighting, given us reason to believe they would eventually break the way every other enemy in our history eventually had. The decision to pursue an armistice did not come easily, and it did not come from any single moment of clarity. It came slowly, painfully, over months of continued losses, that finally convinced even the most stubborn voices within the High Council that this particular war would never end the way our doctrine had always promised our wars would end. There would be no simple surrender. There would be no quiet annexation. There would only be an endless, grinding cost that grew heavier with every passing season, for as long as we continued to insist on fighting it. The final major engagement of the war took place almost 5 years after our first ships arrived in that stubborn, unyielding solar system, and it was unlike anything either side had fought before. It was not a battle meant to achieve victory in the conventional sense. It was, by the time both sides finally understood what was happening, a battle meant simply to determine the terms under which this long, exhausting conflict would finally come to an end. Human forces, now fully unified under a single coordinated command structure, met our remaining fleet in open engagement for the first time in the entire war, no longer relying purely on ambush, deception, or the grinding attrition that had defined so much of the conflict up to that point. I watched from the bridge of my flagship as ships built from technology that had evolved dramatically over 5 brutal years of desperate innovation matched our own vessels in ways that would have seemed impossible on the very first day we arrived. I remember thinking, as that battle unfolded around me, that we were no longer fighting the same species we had first encountered. We were fighting something they had become specifically because of us, forged in 5 years of relentless, brutal conflict into a force our own empire had never anticipated and had no true answer for. The irony of that realization was not lost on me, even in the middle of the fighting itself. We had come to conquer a divided, struggling world, and instead we had built, through our own actions, the very thing that would finally force us to admit defeat. When the fighting finally ended that day, neither side had achieved the kind of decisive victory that either the Compact or humanity had once believed this war would eventually produce. What we had instead was something far more significant, though it took time for both sides to fully understand it. We had reached a point where continuing the fight offered nothing left to gain for either side, and everything left to lose. It was in the quiet, uncertain days following that final engagement that both sides finally began, cautiously and without much trust on either side, to discuss what an end to this war might actually look like. The negotiations that followed took almost as long as the war itself had, though for very different reasons. There was no fighting during those months, only the slow, careful work of 2 exhausted civilizations trying to figure out how to speak to one another without the language of weapons standing between them. I was not present for most of those discussions, having been reassigned by that point to oversee the gradual withdrawal of compact forces from human territory, but I followed the reports closely, and I remember the disbelief that spread through what remained of our fleet when the final terms were finally announced. There would be no annexation. There would be no compact governor installed to oversee human affairs, the way every other conquered world had eventually accepted. Instead, humanity would remain entirely independent, recognized formally by the High Council as a sovereign power, free to govern itself, free to build its own future, free from any obligation to the empire that had spent 5 years and an enormous cost trying to bring it to heel. In exchange, humanity agreed to certain boundaries regarding expansion beyond their own solar system for a fixed period of years, boundaries that both sides understood, without ever saying it aloud, existed primarily to give the Compact time to recover from a war it had never expected to need recovering from. It was not a treaty of conquest. It was, in every meaningful sense, a treaty between equals, the first such agreement in the Compact's entire 10,000-year history. I remember reading those terms for the first time and feeling something I had not expected to feel after everything I had witnessed over the previous 5 years. Relief, certainly, but also something closer to a strange, reluctant respect. We had come to this small, stubborn world with the full weight of an empire behind us, certain that nothing they could offer would ever be enough to earn anything other than submission. Instead, they had fought us to a standstill so thorough that our own High Council had ultimately decided treating them as equals was the only remaining option left. I stayed on Earth for nearly a year after the formal end of hostilities, part of a small delegation tasked with overseeing the final withdrawal of compact forces and establishing the initial diplomatic channels between our two peoples. It was during that year that I finally began to understand, in a way that no battle report or interrogation transcript ever could have taught me, exactly what kind of people we had spent 5 years fighting. I met Grace Whitmore in person for the first time during that final year, at a formal gathering meant to mark the official transition from war to whatever uneasy peace would follow. I recognized her voice before I ever saw her face, the same calm, unshaken tone that had warned us, on the very first day of the war, to think carefully before making our next move. She was older now, quieter in person than I had imagined her, though the same steady conviction remained in everything she said. I asked her, carefully, through a translator that had improved considerably over the years of forced cooperation between our two languages, whether she had ever truly believed her forces could win against an empire as vast and as powerful as the Compact. She considered the question for a long moment before answering, and her answer has stayed with me more clearly than almost anything else from that entire war. She said that winning, in the way I meant it, had never actually been the goal. She said her people had understood, from the very first ultimatum we sent, that they likely could not defeat an empire that had already conquered 1,000 worlds before ever finding theirs. What they could do, she said, was make certain that conquering them would cost more than any empire could reasonably justify paying, for as long as it took for us to understand that some things simply were not worth the price we would have to pay for them. I have thought about that answer for many years since, turning it over in my mind the way you might turn over a stone you cannot quite decide whether to keep. It explained so much of what I had witnessed throughout the war, the reckless ships that refused to retreat, the empty facility that cost us hundreds of soldiers for nothing of strategic value, the quiet, unshaken mercy of a young soldier who chose not to end my life when every advantage that day belonged entirely to him. It had never been about winning in the way my own doctrine understood victory. It had been about something closer to conviction, a belief so deeply held that it shaped every single choice these people made, regardless of the odds stacked against them. Before I finally left Earth for the last time, I sought out one more person whose name had followed me throughout the final years of that long, exhausting war. Owen Baxter, the young soldier who had offered mercy to my broken, exhausted unit in that quiet river valley, had survived the war and gone on to serve in whatever peacekeeping role his government asked of him during the uncertain months following the armistice. I found him overseeing the transfer of a small compact outpost back to civilian human authority, older now, marked visibly by years of a war that had clearly cost him more than he ever spoke about openly. I thanked him, as plainly as the translator allowed, for the mercy he had shown me and my soldiers on the worst day of my long career. He seemed genuinely surprised that I remembered him at all, given how many soldiers he had encountered across years of brutal fighting. When I asked him whether he ever regretted showing kindness to an enemy who had come across the stars specifically to conquer his world, his answer was simple, and it has remained the clearest lesson I took away from this entire war. He said that showing mercy to a defeated enemy had never once felt like weakness to him. He said his people had learned, long before we ever arrived in their solar system, that the true measure of strength was not how much destruction you were capable of, but how much restraint you were willing to show once destruction was no longer necessary. He said he hoped, somewhere in whatever histories our two peoples eventually wrote about this war, that this particular lesson would not be forgotten by either side. I carried that conversation with me across the long journey home, and I have carried it with me every single day since, through decades spent advising younger commanders, through a long and quiet retirement spent trying to make sense of everything I witnessed during those 5 brutal years. I have told this story many times now, to officers still serving, to historians curious about the war that finally taught the Compact the meaning of the word equal, and now, to you, a young journalist eager to understand what really happened on that distant, stubborn world before you were ever born. I know the histories written back home still describe that war in careful diplomatic language, framing the armistice as a mutual decision reached between two civilizations who had simply grown tired of fighting. I understand why those words are chosen carefully. Admitting the full truth is a difficult thing for any empire to do, and the full truth is simply this: We did not choose to stop that war because we grew tired of fighting it. We stopped because we finally understood that we could never win it in any way that would have been worth the cost. Humanity did not defeat us through superior technology, though their technology grew remarkably over those 5 years, adapting and evolving faster than anything our own scientists had ever documented in any other species throughout our long history. They did not defeat us through superior numbers, since they remained, even at the height of their unified resistance, vastly outnumbered by the forces the Compact was capable of bringing to bear against them. What defeated us, in the end, was something far harder to measure and far harder to defend against. It was a will that simply refused to bend, no matter how much pressure we applied, no matter how many losses we inflicted, no matter how thoroughly our own doctrine insisted that every enemy eventually breaks. I am an old man now, by the standards of my own long-lived species, and I have seen a great deal in the many decades since that war finally ended. I have watched humanity grow from a fractured, struggling world into a power that our own Compact now treats with the kind of careful respect once reserved only for civilizations far older and far more established than theirs. I have watched younger officers study the records of that war with a mixture of fascination and quiet unease, searching for lessons that I am not certain can ever be fully captured in any report or any simulation. If there is one thing I would want you to understand, before you write whatever story you intend to write about everything I have told you today, it is this. Strength, in the way most civilizations measure it, means very little against a people who have decided that some things are simply worth any cost required to protect them. We came to that small, stubborn world expecting an easy conquest measured in days. We left it, 5 brutal years later, having learned a lesson that I believe every civilization eventually needs to learn, whether they are prepared for it or not. Never underestimate a people who fight as though they have already accepted the cost of losing everything, because a people willing to pay that price will very often make certain that you pay it right alongside them. That is the truth of what happened on that human war front, as I lived it, as I remember it, and as I will carry it with me for whatever years I have left. I hope, whatever you write, you carry that lesson forward as clearly as I have tried to share it with you today.